On the 20th of October 1979, Doctor Who made history. Episode 4 of City of Death drew in an astonishing 16.1 million viewers, the highest UK viewing figure the series has ever achieved. Across its 4 episodes, the story averaged 14.1 million, making it the most watched adventure in the show's entire history. But those record-breaking numbers didn't happen in isolation. City of Death and Season 17 as a whole benefited from a stroke of luck. ITV, BBC's main rival, was off the air due to industrial action. With no competition, Doctor Who found itself with an audience comparable to Tom Baker's early glory years. Still, City of Death has long been held up as more than just a rating success. It's often cited as one of the greatest stories of the Fourth Doctor era, even one of the best in the show's history. But here's where things get interesting. Unlike classics such as Genesis of the Daleks or Pyramids of Mars, City of Death comes from a much more divisive period in the show's run. One where Douglas Adams's influence as a script editor pushed the tone towards comedy, often at the expense of drama. Yet City of Death is widely seen as the shining exception, the moment when that lighter approach worked. But does it truly deserve that status? Is City of Death a masterpiece born out of genius writing and style, or is it simply the best of a weaker era that's been trumped over time? Let's take a closer look and ask the question, is City of Death one of Doctor Who's most overrated stories? And before you rush to the comments with your thoughts right now, hear me out first. It's a story about fractured time, alien art fraud, and Paris in the springtime. On paper, it shouldn't work. But somehow it does. Or does it? Before we start pulling City of Death apart, let's quickly go over what actually happens. Story opens with an alien spaceship exploding during takeoff. We then cut to the Doctor and Romana enjoying the holiday in Paris when they experience 2 strange time slips. Soon enough, they're drawn into a scheme to steal the Mona Lisa, led by the charming but mysterious Count Scarlione, who has a scientist secretly carrying out time experiments in his cellar. Of course, Scarlioli isn't all he seems. He's actually Scaroff, the alien we saw piloting the ship in the opening scene. The explosion scattered him across Earth's history, and now he's trying to fund experiments that will send him back in time to prevent the accident, even though doing so would stop life from ever forming on Earth. That's the basic plot in a nutshell. It's quite a complicated sci-fi idea. Multiple time zones, paradoxes, cause and effect. It could have been a tangled mess. But thankfully, City of Death keeps things simple. Rather than getting bogged down in technobabble, it plays out more like a stylish caper. The Mona Lisa heist acting as a MacGuffin that keeps the story grounded. It's less about the mechanics of time travel and more about the thrill of the chase. From the very start, the story keeps us hooked. You can't help wondering what the opening spaceship explosion has to do with the Doctor and Romana's holiday in Paris. And by the end of episode 1, you're rewarded with one of the cleverest cliffhangers in Doctor Who history. The revelation that Count Scarlione is really the alien Scaroff. The following episodes keep the rhythm going. Each cliffhanger reveals more about Scaroff's true nature, rather than putting the Doctor or Romana in danger. Episode 2 ends with the Doctor discovering Captain Tancredi, another splinter of Scaroff in Renaissance Italy. And episode 3 shows just how ruthless Scarlione can be, as he coldly kills Professor Kerensky by aging him to death. Behind the charm, he is a monster. By the final episode, when the Doctor reveals that Scaroff's ship exploding sparked the creation of life on Earth, we see the full extent of his obsession. He doesn't care that changing history would wipe out life as we know it. His focus is purely selfish. And the Doctor's reminder that his species, the Jaggeroth, were a warlike race the universe doesn't miss, adds another layer of moral tension. Interestingly, City of Death achieves its pace partly through what it doesn't show. We never actually see the Mona Lisa heist take place, only the rehearsal and the aftermath. Showing it again would slow things down. Even Leonardo da Vinci, who you might expect to appear, never shows up. And honestly, that's for the best. His inclusion would have distracted us from the real focus, Scaroff's fractured existence through time. The story's origins are just as interesting. It begins life as a story called A Gamble with Time by David Fisher, about an alien in disguise using gambling to finance time experiments. Producer Graham Williams didn't like the gambling angle for a family show, so script editor Douglas Adams rewrote it extensively, keeping the core concept but replacing the gambling with art theft. The finished version was credited to David Agnew, the BBC pseudonym used when major rewrites were done in-house. That pseudonym's history is also mixed. It was also used on The Invasion of Time, a rushed and messy season finale, and others like Norman Ashby, used on Dominators, were similarly a result of behind-the-scenes friction. But sometimes pseudonyms produce gems, like The Brain of Morbius, written by Robin Bland, aka Terence Dix and Robert Holmes, and The Demons, written by Guy Leopold, aka Barry Letts and Robert Sloman. And thankfully, City of Death falls firmly into that successful category. Douglas Adams' rewrite turned a potentially messy sci-fi concept into one of Doctor Who's most stylish and accessible stories. So far, City of Death earns a thumbs up for how it delivers a narrative. Clever, clear, and confident. But are we overlooking something? Is there more beneath that witty surface that explains why it's held in such high regard? Or just perhaps why some people might say it's overrated? If there's one thing City of Death is remembered for, beyond witty dialogue and Tom Baker's scarf flapping in the Parisian breeze, it's that it was the first Doctor Who story ever filmed abroad. From the very beginning, Paris was always part of the script, but the original plan was to recreate the city inside BBC studios. It was actually future producer John Nathan Turner, working at time as the production unit manager, who realised it would be cheaper and more effective to film on location in Paris itself. And it's fair to say that decision pays off visually. The production team make full use of the city, showing off iconic landmarks such as the Eiffel Tower, Champs-Élysées, and of course the Louvre. These sequences gave the story a glossy, cinematic quality, kind of glamour that Doctor Who had never achieved before. But does that glamour perhaps distract us from some of the story's limitations? Is City of Death a case of style over substance? When you start to look closely, you notice something interesting. Only three of the main cast, Tom Baker, Lalla Ward, and Tom Chapman, who plays the private detective Duggan, actually appear in those Paris location scenes. Once you realise that, the magic starts to fade just a little. Take episode 1 for example. We get a full montage of the Doctor and Romana wandering from the Eiffel Tower to a cafe, something that in any other story would have been condensed into a quick transition. Then we get another montage as they visit the Louvre, and again when Duggan follows them back to the cafe. By the end of episode 1, we spent quite a bit of screen time simply sightseeing. The trick is repeated again in episode 4, with a chase from Scarleone's chateau back to the TARDIS. More travel, more padding. Now, that's not to say it doesn't work. These sequences are undeniably beautiful, and they give City of Death a breezy sense of pace. The story feels fast-moving, even when very little is actually happening. The Parisian backdrop keeps the audience visually engaged, and that's the clever television making. But imagine if those scenes had been filmed on a BBC backlot, or if the story had taken place somewhere less glamorous. Would City of Death still have that same charm? In many ways, the Parisian location filming is Doctor Who padding at its absolute finest. Sequences that add nothing to the plot, but everything to the experience. It's a perfect example of how City of Death disguises its simplicity under a layer of style, atmosphere, and adventure. Without it, the story would feel far smaller and maybe far less special. When it comes to Douglas Adams, most people immediately think of The Hitchhiker's Guide to the Galaxy, and with it, his trademark brand of clever, intellectual humour. That same highbrow wit became a defining feature of his time on Doctor Who, both as a writer and a script editor. Season 17 in particular leaned heavily into comedy, and that's something that divided opinion amongst fans ever since. For some, it made the show feel lighter, more playful. For others, it tipped too far into self-parody. But City of Death stands apart. Instead of slapstick or silliness, it delivers a more restrained, witty tone, the kind of humour that feels effortlessly clever rather than forced. The script is packed with sharp wordplay and subtle innuendo. Take the Doctor's line to Countess Scarleone. "You're a beautiful woman, probably." It's not just funny, it's quintessentially Doctor Who. Charming, alien, and wonderfully detached from human convention. Then there are small gags that perfectly capture Douglas Adams' style, like the Doctor ordering glasses of water and asking the waiter to make them doubles, or quipping that cold hands are more painful than thumbscrews. Even Romana gets in on the act, admiring the view from the Eiffel Tower and suggesting that they fly around Paris, to which the Doctor replies, "Let's not be ostentatious." There's also a satirical edge to the story's art world setting. Romana dryly dismisses the Mona Lisa as something a computer could replicate, and the narrative pokes fun at the pretensions of art critics. It's a perfect touch, capped off by cameos from John Cleese and Eleanor Bron, whose characters analyse the TARDIS as though it's a piece of modern art, and barely react when it dematerialises before their eyes. Beneath the witty dialogue and playful tone, City of Death also contains some surprisingly adult subtext, the kind that slips past younger audiences. Take the scene between Count Scarleone and his wife, the Countess. When he scolds her for playing games, she replies, "What else have I been doing all these years?" To adult viewers, the meaning is clear. A marriage built on material comfort and manipulation, laced with innuendo that would gone straight over a child's head. Yet, it also hints at the Countess's tragic naivety. Her failure to question her husband's crimes or even realise she's married to a one-eyed green alien, as the Doctor later points out. Beyond the humour and subtext, City of Death also reflects a more relaxed attitude of late 1970s television, with scenes featuring guns, smoking and open drinking. It's a reminder that family viewing had very different boundaries back then compared to today. So, while the clever dialogue and sophistication of City and Death elevate it above other stories of its era, you can't help but wonder, is it ever too clever for its own good? Does its wit add richness to the story, or does it risk distancing itself from the adventure at its core? Like any performance medium, whether it be television, film, radio, or theatre, story can only succeed if its cast brings it to life. The writing, design, and direction can all be exceptional, but ultimately, delivery of the actors determines whether a story truly works. Doctor Who has had its fair share of both strong and weak performances, often making or breaking a story. With City of Death, the production already looked visually impressive. The narrative favoured a light, fast-paced, thriller-chase structure, and Douglas Adams' trademark humour ran throughout. For this blend to work, the performances needed to strike the right tone, and they did. Tom Baker's performance of the Doctor demonstrates exactly why his presence could elevate any story. Here, he fully embraces Adams's wit, applying it seamlessly to the eccentric persona of the Fourth Doctor. Ever the alien observer of humanity, Baker channels Patrick Troughton's influence, making the Doctor appear foolish on the surface while staying several steps ahead of everyone else. This is especially evident when he, Romana and Duggan are captured and taken to Scarleone's chateau. Playing the fool, he convinces Scarleone that he stole the Countess's bracelet simply because it was pretty, masking his awareness of its alien nature. Later, his feigned stupidity helps him conceal the fact that he's actually a Time Lord, which would help Scaroff, but something that is eventually revealed. Lalla Ward, newly settled into the role of Romana after replacing Mary Tam, delivers one of her best performances ever. She blends several sides of the character, the wide-eyed tourist enjoying the Parisian adventure, the confident time lady capable of solving complex puzzles in seconds, and the intellectual equal to the Doctor. Her delight in exploring contrasts beautifully the moments of naivety, particularly when she unwittingly aids Scaroff by admitting she could complete his time machine, a sharp counterpart to the Doctor deliberately clowning around. The chemistry between Baker and Ward is another standout. Their soon-to-be real-life romance, soon to result in marriage, gives their on-screen dynamic a natural warmth and playfulness. During the Paris location scenes, their interactions feel spontaneous and genuine, as if the two travellers simply enjoy themselves. It helps that neither of the actors were actually recognised in France, where Doctor Who wasn't being broadcast at the time. Balancing out this cerebral duo is Duggan, the blunt, action-first detective played by Tom Shadban. While lacking the Doctor and Romana's intellect, Duggan's punch-first, think-later attitude makes him both hilarious and endearing, and ultimately essential. His impulsive nature literally saves the day, turning him into one of Doctor Who's most memorable one-off characters. As for the villain, Julian Glover's Scarroff is a masterclass in laid performance. As the charming Count Scarlione, he exudes suave menace. As the unmasked Scarroff, he's driven, desperate and terrifying. There's also a definite Bond villain quality to his portrayal, which is fitting, since Glover would go on to play one in For Your Eyes Only 2 years later. His other roles, such in films like The Empire Strikes Back, Indiana Jones and the Last Crusade, and the TV series Game of Thrones, further prove he was born to play sophisticated antagonists. Even the supporting cast elevate proceedings. Catherine Schell brings wit and poise to the Countess. David Graham lends depth to the tragic Professor Kerensky, and it's also a nice nod that he was also one of the original Dalek voices. And Kevin Flood's loyal henchman Herman adds that touch of menace. Altogether, City of Death succeeds not just because of its script or production design, but because every actor, from lead to minor role, completely commits to its tone. It's a story where casting, chemistry, and performance align perfectly, ensuring that humour, mystery, and drama all land exactly as intended. At the start of this video, I asked whether City of Death is one of Doctor Who's most overrated stories. On paper, the viewing figures might suggest that, boosted by that lack of competition on television at the time, and standing head and shoulders above Tom Baker's later stories. But when you look beyond those numbers, it's clear that City of Death earns every bit of its acclaim. It achieves everything it sets out to do, and succeeds in all areas that make Doctor Who great. Where it could have stumbled through over-reliance on its humour or pacing, it instead holds its balance perfectly, combining wit, style and energy into one of the most effortlessly enjoyable adventures the series has ever produced. That success, however, also highlights a sense of disappointment, because nothing else in Season 17 quite reaches its level. Douglas Adams once claimed that the unfinished story Sharda, intended as the season finale, and written with similar comedic flair, would have been even better. Yet, even with the surviving footage and later animated reconstruction, I find it hard to believe it would have matched City of Death's polish and charm. In many ways, City of Death represents exactly what Adams and producer Graham Williams were trying to achieve with Season 17. A lighter, wittier Doctor Who that still felt ambitious and intelligent. Had the time and budget allowed, it might have been one of Tom Baker's strongest seasons. But realistically, those production limitations made it impossible to replicate City of Death's standard across the rest of the run. Of course, the show's record-breaking ratings were also helped by external circumstances, most notably the ITV strike, which removed its main rival from the schedules. Without that stroke of luck, City of Death likely wouldn't have achieved the same astronomical viewing figures. But quality should never be judged by ratings alone. Audience numbers have always been shaped by scheduling, competition, and wider cultural interest rather than creative merit. Consider Inferno from the Third Doctor era, now regarded as one of the greatest Doctor Who stories ever made, yet it only averaged 5.5 million viewers. The Case of Androzani, repeatedly voted the best story of all time, averaged 7.3 million. Even Patrick Troughton's era, adored by fans, never reached above 9 million viewers. Meanwhile, the Sylvester McCoy era, producing stories such as Remembrance of the Daleks and Curse of Fenric, are sometimes unfairly dismissed simply because of declining ratings. Clearly, numbers never tell the whole story. Had City of Death aired under similar circumstances, his reputation might not have grown quite so large, but its popularity endures, not because of inflated viewing figures, rather because it's an endlessly rewatchable, engaging story that encapsulates so much of what makes Doctor Who special. It's accessible, witty, beautifully performed, and a perfect gateway for anyone discovering the classic series for the first time. Does it surpass Tom Baker's earlier masterpieces like Genesis of the Daleks or Pyramids of Mars? No. Those stories operate on a grander, darker scale. But City of Death doesn't need to compete with them. It succeeds entirely on its own terms. Ambitious, yet relaxed. Clever, yet playful. And unmistakably of its era. And it's hard to imagine it working so perfectly with anyone other than Tom Baker leading the way. So I've now actually gone and convinced myself that City of Death isn't overrated. But tell me, what do you think of it? Maybe I'm giving it too much credit. Maybe I'm being harsh on the story by denying its place among some of the earlier Fourth Doctor stories. Let me know in the comments below. But for now, it's the end. The moment has been prepared for.